They were about to have some fun time when the girl stopped. I really should have mentioned this earlier, but I'm actually a call girl and I charge $20 for this. The man reluctantly paid her, and they did their thing. After a cigarette, the man just sat in the driver's seat, looking out the window. "Why aren't we going anywhere?" asked the girl. "Well, I should have mentioned this before, but I'm actually a taxi driver, and the fare back to town is $25. There was this guy at a restaurant, just looking at his drink. He stays like that for a half hour. Then a big trouble-making truck driver steps next to him, takes the drink from the guy, and just drinks it all down. The poor man starts crying. The truck driver says, "Come on, man, I was just joking. Here, I'll buy you another drink. I just can't stand to see a man cry." "No, it's not that," the man replies, wiping his tears. "This day is the worst of my life. First, I oversleep, and I go in late to my office. My outraged boss fires me. When I leave the building to go to my car, I find out it was stolen. The police say they can do nothing. I get a cab to go home, and when I get out, I remember I left my wallet. The cab driver just drives away. I go inside my house where I find my wife in bed with the gardener. I leave my home, come to this restaurant, and just when I was thinking about putting an end to my life, you show up and drink my poison." A man was sitting at a restaurant, enjoying an after-work cocktail when an exceptionally gorgeous young woman entered. She was so striking that the man could not take his eyes away from her. The young woman noticed his overly attentive stare and walked directly toward him. Before he could offer his apologies for being so rude, the young woman said to him, "I'll do anything, absolutely anything that you want me to do, no matter how kinky, for $100 on one condition." Flabbergasted, the man asked what the condition was. The young woman replied, "You have to tell me what you want me to do in just 3 words." The man considered her proposition for a moment, withdrew his wallet from his pocket, and slowly counted out 5 $20 bills, which he pressed into the young woman's hand. He looked deeply into her eyes and slowly, meaningfully said, "Paint my house." 3 biker buddies are sitting in a restaurant. A man, who's already heavily intoxicated, walks in, sits down, and orders a drink. The man looks around and sees the 3 bikers sitting at a table in a corner of the restaurant. He gets up, staggers over to their table, and leans over it. Looking the biggest of the 3 men in the eye, the drunk man says, "I went by your grandma's house and saw her completely through the window. Man, she's fine." The biker looks at the drunk man and doesn't say anything. His buddies look confused because people have had their faces kicked in for saying less than that to him in the past. Leaning against the table once more, the drunk man says, "I slept with your grandma too. She's the best I ever had." Still, no response is received from the biker. However, his buddies are now starting to get angry. The drunk man continues, "I'll tell you something else too. Your grandma loved it." Finally, the biker stands up and says, "You're drunk. Grandpa, go home." In a small town, a doctor is about to retire, and he is training a young colleague to replace him. The young doctor observes as they visit the patients at their homes together. "Doctor, "I've been having a constant stomachache lately," cries the first patient. The old doctor says, "You've been eating too much fruit. Eat less fruit and you should feel better." As the two doctors leave the house, the young man asks, "How did you make a diagnosis so quickly? You didn't even examine the lady." "Simple. I dropped my stethoscope, and as I was picking it up, I saw that the trash can under the table was full of banana peels. I immediately realized what was wrong." They move on to the next house, where they are greeted by another lady. This time, it's the young doctor's turn. "Doctor, I've been feeling exhausted and weak lately," complains the lady. "Well, ma'am, maybe you should do less volunteering for the church and get more rest," replies the young doctor. As they leave, the surprised old doctor asks his colleague, "How did you know that? After all, you didn't even examine the lady, and you don't know anything about her." "Simple," replies the young doctor. "I dropped my stethoscope, and as I was picking it up, I saw the priest under the bed." "Hi, Fred. This is Alan next door. I have a confession to make. I've been feeling guilty these past few months and have been trying to pluck up the courage to tell you. But at least I'm telling you now in a text message, as I feel bad about you not knowing. The truth is, I have been sharing your wife a lot lately. In fact, probably more than you. I haven't been able to get it at home recently, but that's no excuse, I know. The temptation was too much. I feel so guilty, and I hope you will accept my sincerest apologies. It won't happen again. Please suggest a usage fee and I'll pay you. Regards, Alan." The actions. Fred, feeling betrayed and insulted, grabbed his gun. He is an American after all. Rushed next door and shot his neighbor dead. He returned home, poured himself a stiff drink, and sat down on the sofa to reflect. Then he took out his phone and saw he had a second message from his neighbor. Second message. "Hi, Fred. Alan here again. Sorry about the typo on my last text. I guess you figured it out anyway. The autocorrect changed Wi-Fi to wife. Technology, hey? Regards, Alan." There were 3 receptionists at a convention, each talking about how dodgy their co-workers were. The first said, "Nobody is more dodgy than car salesmen. My colleagues will patch up a car so that it will drive just far enough away from the yard before it breaks down, and then claim that it was in perfect working order." The second said, "That's nothing. I work in a law office. They'll represent your co-workers in court and make sure that they aren't responsible for that lemon. They're the dodgiest." "Wow," the third receptionist said. "That hits close to home. I recently bought a car that did exactly that. I drove it to work and parked, but when I came out after work, it wouldn't start. I took the car yard to court, and their lawyer successfully argued that they weren't at fault." "So which was dodgier?" the first asked. "My colleagues. I work for the local police, and while I was sitting in my broken-down car in the station car park, trying to get it started, one of my colleagues reversed into me and then arrested me for reckless driving." A man enters the patent office carrying some of his new designs. He approaches the clerk and says, "I'd like to register my new inventions." The clerk replies, "Sure, let's see what you have." The man places the first item on the counter and says, The first is a folding bottle. That's interesting, says the clerk. What do you call it? A fottle, replies the inventor. A fottle? Asks the clerk. That's not a very descriptive name. Can't you think of something else? I'll think about it, replies the inventor. I've got something else, though. It's a folding carton. And what do you call that? Asks the clerk. A farton, replies the inventor. That's just rude. You can't possibly call it that. Well, I do have one other product, says the inventor. But I doubt you're going to like the name of that product either. What is that, sir? Asks the clerk. The inventor replies, a folding bucket. Jane read that milk baths would make her beautiful, so she left a note for her milkman to leave 15 gallons of milk at her door. When the milkman read the note, he felt there must be a mistake. He thought she probably meant 1.5 gallons, so he knocked on the door to clarify the message. Jane came to the door, and the milkman said, I found your note to leave 15 gallons of milk. Did you mean 15 gallons or 1.5 gallons? I want 15 gallons. I'm going to fill my bathtub up with milk and take a milk bath, Jane replied. Oh, okay. Pasteurized? Asked the milkman. No, just up to my chest, said Jane. One would dig a hole. He would dig, dig, dig. The other would come behind him and fill the hole. Fill, fill, fill. These two men worked furiously. One digging a hole, the other filling it up again. A man was watching from the sidewalk and couldn't believe how hard these men were working, but couldn't understand what they were doing. Finally, he had to ask them. He said to the hole digger, I appreciate how hard you work, but what are you doing? You dig a hole and your partner comes behind you and fills it up again. The hole digger replied, Oh yeah, must look funny, but the guy who plants the trees is sick today. Three guys were at deer camp. They had to bunk two to a room. No one wanted to room with Steve because he snored so badly. They decided it wasn't fair to make one of them stay with him the whole time, so they voted to take turns. The first night, John slept in Steve's room and came to breakfast the next morning with his hair a mess and his eyes all bloodshot. The rest of the guys said, Man, what happened to you? He said, Steve snored so loudly. I just sat up and watched him all night. The next night it was Gary's turn. In the morning, same thing, hair all standing up, eyes all bloodshot. Once again they asked, Man, what happened to you? You look awful. He said, Man, that Steve shakes the roof. I couldn't sleep a wink. I just watched him all night. The third night was Herb's turn. Herb was a big burly guy who loved to fish and hunt, a man's man. The next morning, he came to breakfast, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Good morning, he said. The guys couldn't believe it. They said, Man, what happened? He said, Well, we got ready for bed. I went and tucked Steve into bed and kissed him good night. He sat up and watched me all night long. A wealthy married woman is approached by her maid, who politely requests a substantial raise in her modest wages. Known for her frugality, the lady of the house demands to know why her servant should be entitled to such a significant raise. The maid responds, "Well, ma'am, I can give you 3 reasons why I deserve an increase. The first is that I iron better than you do." The wealthy woman, taken aback, questions, "Who said that you iron better than me?" The maid replies, "Your husband did." The maid continues, "The second reason is that I am a better cook than you." The woman dismisses this claim, saying, "Nonsense! Who said you're a better cook than I am?" Again, the maid responds, "Your husband did." Growing increasingly agitated, the wealthy woman demands, "And the third reason?" The maid confidently states, "I am better at intimacy than you are." The wife, now seething, asks, "And did my husband say that as well?" The maid replies, "No, ma'am. The gardener did." Two brothers who lived on adjoining farms fell into conflict. It was the first serious rift in 40 years of farming side by side, sharing machinery and trading labor and goods as needed without a hitch. Then the long collaboration fell apart. It began with a small misunderstanding, and it grew into a major difference. And finally, it exploded into an exchange of bitter words, followed by weeks of silence. One morning, there was a knock on John's door. He opened it to find a man with a carpenter's toolbox. "I'm looking for a few days' work," he said. "Perhaps you would have a few small jobs here and there. Could I help you?" "Yes," said the older brother. "I do have a job for you. Look across the creek at that farm. That's my neighbor. In fact, it's my younger brother. Last week there was a meadow between us, and he took his bulldozer to the river levee, and now there is a creek between us. Well, he may have done this to spite me, but I'll go him one better. See that pile of lumber curing by the barn? I want you to build me a fence, an 8-foot fence, so I won't need to see his place anymore." The carpenter said, "I think I understand the situation. Show me the nails and the post hole digger, and I'll be able to do a job that pleases you." The older brother had to go to town for supplies, so he helped the carpenter get the materials ready, and then he was off for the day. The carpenter worked hard all that day, measuring, sawing, nailing. About sunset, when the farmer returned, the carpenter had just finished his job. The farmer's eyes opened wide, his jaw dropped. There was no fence there at all. It was a bridge stretching from one side of the creek to the other. A fine piece of work, handrails and all. And the neighbor, his younger brother, was coming across, his hand outstretched. "You are quite a fellow to build this bridge after all I've said and done." The two brothers stood at each end of the bridge, and then they met in the middle, taking each other's hand. They turned to see the carpenter hoist his toolbox on his shoulder. "No, wait. Stay a few days. I've a lot of other projects for you," said the older brother. "I'd love to stay on," the carpenter said, "but I have many more bridges to build." The other night, I was invited out for a night with the girls. I told Jerry that I would be home by midnight. I promise. Well, the hours passed, and the Bacardis went down way too easily. Around 3 a.m., a bit loaded, I headed for home. Just as I got in the door, the cuckoo clock in the hallway started up and cuckooed 3 times. Quickly, realizing Jerry would probably wake up, I cuckooed another 9 times. I was really proud of myself for coming up with such a quick-witted solution in order to escape a possible conflict with him, even when totally smashed. 3 cuckoos plus 9 cuckoos totals, for the so 12 cuckoos, midnight. Brilliant, eh? The next morning, Jerry asked me what time I got in. I told him midnight. He didn't seem pissed off in the least. Whew, I got away with that one. Then he said, we need a new cuckoo clock. When I asked him why, he said, well, last night our clock cuckooed 3 times, then said, oh sh. It then cuckooed 4 more times, cleared its throat, cuckooed another 3 times, giggled, cuckooed twice more, and then tripped over the coffee table and 2 young guys appear in court after being arrested for smoking dope. The judge says, you seem like nice young men, and I'd like to give you a second chance instead of jail time. I want you to go out this weekend and try to convince others of the evils of drug use. I'll see you back in court Monday. On Monday, the judge asks the first guy, how did you do over the weekend? Well, Your Honor, I persuaded 17 people to give up drugs forever. 17 people? That's wonderful. How did you do it? I used a diagram, Your Honor. I drew 2 circles like this. Then I told them that the big circle is your brain before drugs, and the small circle is your brain after drugs. That's admirable, says the judge. Then he turns to the second guy. And how did you do? Well, Your Honor, I persuaded 156 people to give up drugs forever. Wow, says the judge. 156 people. How did you manage to do that? Well, I used a similar diagram, the guy says. I drew 2 circles like this. Then I pointed to the little circle and said, this is your as before prison. A Frenchman and an Italian were seated next to an American on an overseas flight. After a few cocktails, the men began discussing their home lives. Last night I made love to my wife 4 times, the Frenchman bragged. And this morning she made me delicious crepes. And she told me how much she adored me. Ah, last night I made love to my wife 6 times, the Italian responded. And this morning she made me a wonderful omelette and told me she could never love another man. When the American remained silent, the Frenchman smugly asked, and how many times did you make love to your wife last night? Once, he replied. Only once, the Italian arrogantly snorted. And what did she say to you this morning? Don't stop. A dude-up city biker walks into a seedy tavern in the outback of Western Australia. He sits at the restaurant and notices a grizzled old biker with his arms folded, staring blankly at a full bowl of chili. After 15 minutes of just sitting there staring at it, the newbie rider bravely asks the old biker, "If you ain't gonna eat that, mind if I do?" The old veteran of 1,000 rides slowly turns his head toward the young and says, "Nah, you go ahead." Eagerly, The guy wearing the shiny new leather fashions reaches over and slides the bowl into his place and starts spooning it in with delight. He gets nearly down to the bottom of the bowl and notices a dead mouse in the chili. The sight was very shocking, and he immediately barfed up the chili back into the bowl. The old biker quietly says, "Yep, that's as far as I got too.